Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of Thriving with Rachel and Dr. Lou. In the past week we've gotten several questions regarding the idea and concept of validation. So what we're going to do tonight is talk about validation and talking a little bit about the differences between how when we're in an experience, particularly with anxiety or worries, how we tend to try to encourage ourselves to be okay and tell ourselves that it's all right, we're getting through it. It's that pep talk, right? And people mistaken that for validation. And what we want to clarify is, for validation, you kind of need to believe it, right? So if you're going through that experience and telling yourself, oh, it's okay, I'm going to be okay, but you're freaking out inside, they don't really match. And so it makes it really hard to calm down and actually feel okay, which is what our goal is, right? So the best way to start looking at validation is to really identify what's going on. If you're worried, acknowledge it. Say, this is scary. I'm worried. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm struggling. That's what's validation. That's where we start.
Yeah, and I think we mentioned that a couple of podcasts ago, this idea of validation. Not just, I think we talked about it when we were mentioning identifying your experience. So the first thing is awareness, to really notice when you're maybe in your head or you're struggling with overwhelm, anxiety, whatever it might be, and the purpose behind validation. A lot of the questions that we got this week was very much focused on the fact that, oh, well, I'm telling myself it's okay, or I'm doing X, Y, and Z things, but for some reason it's not working. For some reason I'm still freaking out, or, and I've multiple times a week I feel like I do that, or I'm pep talking myself and saying, it's okay, like you're fine, like it's gonna be okay, or, by the end of the week it's gonna be fine, or just make it to the weekend. And if you really think about what that actually means, it's more so you're just powering through, right? You're not actually validating yourself, you're not meeting yourself where you are, you're sucking it up, I guess, until the time passes. And while that sometimes works for, I guess, a period of time, the question is always, is that really how you want to experience life? Or do we want to move more towards a thriving state of life where you actually validate yourself, meet yourself where you are, and change the entire experience?
Yeah, so oftentimes as you were describing that, I'm thinking of the person who's white knuckling it, right? Like, I'm going to be okay, I'm going to be okay. and that's like not okay, right? You're struggling.
Well, it's just not our preference.
It's not our preference.
If we really look at it.
Yeah. And so it's important to be real, right? Because oftentimes a lot of people are talking about how they struggle with positive self-talk, for example. And so they tell themselves all these positive things, but they don't believe any of it.
Right.
So they come back and talk to us about, oh, that didn't work.
Like, I challenged the thought, and I think we come from a CBT, cognitive behavioral background, as most of you probably know by now. And so a lot of people will say, oh, I tried to refute the thought, or I tried to challenge the thought. And they'll say, they might say, I feel like the dumbest person ever for, you messed up with something. And they're like, well, I challenged the thought and I told myself I'm really smart. True. There's probably validity in that.
Smart.
You probably are smart. There's probably evidence to that, except in the moment when you're telling yourself, I'm the dumbest person ever, why did you do that? Do you believe that you're smart, even if there's evidence to it?
Right.
That's the logical part of your mind. And I think that's where we kind of get mixed up, is that validation is not pep talking with logic. Validation is really acknowledging what it is that I'm experiencing, that awareness, and how I'm experiencing it. Not sugarcoating it, not judging myself for it, but simply recognizing, right now in this moment, this kind of sucks. Like, I hate how this conversation with my spouse went, or, I really hate to see my kids struggling, and I wish that I didn't beat myself up for not being a good enough parent. That's validation. It's what you are actually experiencing. I often say it's kind of like the first two sentences of rumination, if you will. So instead of continuing the spiral, the first couple sentences, which are real, is validation, right? But then moving from there is the difference between validation and ruminating, right?
And it's important to notice that before we move, why is it important to validate that, right? I think it's a couple different things. First of all, you need to be congruent with what the experience is.
Right.
If you're not, if you're trying to just do that pep talk, there's incongruency there. There's a disconnect. And therefore you don't feel like this is accurate. Right. It's not genuine.
Right.
And because of that, you're already on a on the wrong path.
Well, you're fighting yourself, essentially,
Exactly.
right? You're lying
Right.
to yourself. It's not believable. It's kind of like when somebody else tries to pep talk you and you're like, yeah, sure.
Right.
Oh,
And
am
you
I
just
smart?
kinda-
Am I smart, Mom? Thank you. You're just saying that because you're my mom. Like,
Right.
right?
And that's what we're hearing to ourselves.
Right.
And so we do the exact same thing when somebody else is trying to tell us those things. We dismiss it.
Right.
Right? We don't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order to believe things, we need to be truthful with ourselves.
Right.
If we're struggling, validate that you're struggling.
Mm-hmm.
Validate that you're scared. Validate that you're worried or overwhelmed. And do something.
Right.
The second piece, which is really important, is to move.
Right. That pivot.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
We often talk about changing perspectives, right? Shifting our focus on things, changing the mindset. Physically moving.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm here and I'm struggling, maybe I go for a walk outside. Maybe I just change the environment a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that's really important to remember is not only validating, but then doing something.
Right.
And doing something. There's 2 steps there.
Right. I think oftentimes when we don't do something, that's what qualifies as rumination. So when you
Yeah.
get stuck in your head and you realize like 20 minutes later you're just still sitting there sulking about whatever it might be, which is valid. Sometimes we might just need to sit in it and allow ourselves to do that, but that's not what validation is. And I guess you started talking about what the importance of validation is, and I think I want to kind of revisit that for a second, because if we're not validating, oftentimes we're just starting from uneven ground, if you will. If we're not validating, we tend to be just kind of kicking ourselves, judging ourselves for where we are, assuming that we shouldn't be there, telling ourselves that, we're better than that, or whatever it might be. And so if we're starting from there, it's really hard to actually move. It's really hard to actually make change, because in the back of your mind, you're still kicking yourself for being, I guess, stuck in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's the reason that validation is so important. And again, why I want to differentiate the difference between validation and rumination, because they can feel the same sometimes and seem the same. So that's why I want to make sure I'm emphasizing what Lou's talking about right now, is that there has to be a pivot, there has to be a change for validation to be effective, right? So I'm really struggling right now in this moment. I hate that I'm struggling again when I've told myself multiple times that I don't want to struggle anymore, because that's how it works, right?
That is.
And now what do I want? Do I still want X, Y, and Z things that I was just working towards? Or do I want to change the expectation or change the goal? Right?
Or can I?
Right.
Is there another option? Is there another way to look at this,
Mm-hmm.
right? Another piece that, as you were talking, came to mind is that when we are going down that path, trying to make a change, we're still going to have those doubts. We're still going to have that worry. So even though we create a validation to it, even we acknowledge it, and it's genuine, it's congruent,
Mm-hmm.
just because you move on or try to move in a physical way or in a mindful way,
Mm-hmm.
those thoughts are still present.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to come back around. And it's important to validate again,
Mm-hmm.
acknowledge them, and keep moving forward. I
Right.
think we often get stuck there too, because we feel like, wait, I tried to move on. I
Right.
walked
I already
outside,
did that.
I did this, I did that,
Why is it
and you're
back?
still there. You know?
Right.
That's just more evidence that what you're experiencing is real, and that's okay.
Right.
I think another big issue here is that people feel like whatever you're experiencing isn't
It's not
okay.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not okay with it.
Right.
Like, I don't want this.
Right.
So what do I do with it?
Mhm.
Well, it's important to validate what you don't want to.
Right.
That what you're going through is tough.
And to acknowledge it. I mean, I guess that's the other part too of where we get stuck with rumination, is we're so focused on what we don't want, which I know we've talked about a couple weeks ago, but to identify what we do want as a result of maybe not having this discomfort anymore, like what would exist, validation and pivoting, validation and turning in a direction that you want, that's the whole goal, as opposed to recognizing I'm here, I don't want to be here, why am I here, how to get here, which is oftentimes where we stay stuck, right? Have you had any stuck, not to put you on the spot, have you had any stuck points at all this week that you can think of
Yeah.
off the top of your head?
So, oftentimes, I'm overseeing Sonari's licensing certifications.
Your favorite.
Right. Inspections of all the different locations and stuff like that. And, every time the state comes back and says, I didn't get this policy, or this policy doesn't address this, or where do you have this information? I cringe.
Mm-hmm.
And I always open up the email, I read it, and then I mark
Close
it
it.
as unread and put it away for
Yeah.
a little while. Because I don't want to go there.
Mhm.
Like, I just
What's the thought process around it?
That it's too much, that I'm not going to get this right, that to get it right is going to take me hours and hours of grueling reading, reviewing, rewriting, and like if you approved it last year, why isn't it approved this year? Like that kind of stuff.
I think I've heard you saying that while you're going through it of like, why is it that every year, even though I do this every year, why do I still miss things? Why is it still, I feel like I got everything together and for some reason it's still not enough. And I imagine that's really frustrating.
Extremely frustrating. And so oftentimes what I struggle with is I like things to go my way. Right? A little controlling. And I've been blessed in many ways that for the majority of day-to-day activities, things go okay, or I'm pretty flexible with them. Things don't really ruffle my feathers too much. But when they do, it's like, what do I do? Like that just,
So how do you navigate that?
So a couple different things. What I've learned to do is part of validating is saying to myself, I know I don't want to deal with this. I know this is awful. I know I can't stand doing this stuff. And so I give myself permission to put the email back as unread. And I pause it. I take a step back. I either, if it's in the morning like it was today, actually this is very appropriate for this, I go get my coffee. I have a few sips of my coffee, I sit down, play with my dog for a little bit, and kind of just ease into it, and then I go back to opening the email. And my wife taught me this a very long time ago in one of the books that I was writing, because I was getting overwhelmed. The publisher was expecting it to be a certain day and stuff like that to be done. And so what she said was to one chapter at a time. You have all these chapters to write, just literally put paper down on all the chapters and just move it down to see the one chapter that I'm working on. Focus on that. So that's the same thing I do nowadays with a lot of times whenever I feel overwhelmed, when I feel like there's too much to do, I break it down. I literally cover whatever it is I don't want to look at. I validate myself that I don't want to look at that, and I acknowledge that that's hard. So I'm going to look at one thing at a time. And sometimes I do that and it takes too long in my mind to do, so I take another break. I refill my coffee, or I take a walk around the block, or I decide to feed the dog because I forgot this morning. And I said, oh, that's a good excuse to put this down and go do this. So there's lots of different things that I've learned to do over the years, and part of it that's really helpful is the whole idea of validating where I am. It creates such a relief to just be connected to what actually is going on.
And you use the word permission.
Yeah.
Which I really like, this idea of giving yourself permission to just be, which we sort of talked about last week a little bit, is can I just be present even though the present is uncomfortable? Can I just sit with that as opposed to trying to get rid of it or judging myself for being there in the first place like we were just talking about? Is that something that's possible for me? Is that something I'm willing or open to doing? And I don't know that the answer is always yes. So that idea of giving yourself permission, I think, like you were referring to, it opens up the door to be able to do the next thing. I think it takes the pressure for you in this example. It takes the pressure off of you having to do it right now because you think it needs to be done right now, which maybe it does. But the idea is that telling myself that it needs to be done or that it's late is not making me get it done faster.
Right.
Like beating myself up doesn't make me get done any better. Right. But I think a lot of times, and I don't know if this is something you've experienced, I have in the past, of being hard on myself is something that actually pushes me, or I perceive it to push me to do things faster, better, whatever it might be. I tell myself I work really well under pressure, which I think I do to an extent. But you have to step back and ask yourself, do I really want to be able to accomplish things and get things done after beating myself up? Like that's the way that I get things done, to kick myself and be mean to myself? I don't know. I think over time I've learned that doesn't work for me because it doesn't feel good. I could check it off the list, but the experience to get it done, it sucked. It was awful. It's that power through that you were mentioning, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a hard line to navigate, and it's one that I think, giving yourself permission, that's kind of where that comes in. Definitely. Giving myself permission. Question for you though. Permission, like where's the line between giving yourself permission to pause and avoiding and pushing off and kind of giving yourself an excuse, or it's like kind of like a cop out for doing things.
Well, I think it goes back to, what do you want? You know, in terms of the time frame, do I want to get done this?
Mm-hmm.
Do I want to get the license approved again, right? Do I want to keep the company running?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So,
Well, so this is one thing though. Let's say that, because I'm sure yourself and multiple people, we get overwhelmed with the laundry list of things
yeah.
that all seem like they take priority. So maybe I have a deadline at work that I need to get done. Maybe I have to make sure that my yard is ready for some treatment or something, tomorrow. Maybe my kid needs help with their homework, and all of this stuff is either late or needs to get done today. And so I don't know how to prioritize because they're all due right now. How do you, I know you mentioned focus on just one thing, but how do you do that when it feels like everything needs your attention, and maybe in reality it does?
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that?
A couple different ideas. When it comes to prioritizing things, you can look at it from a couple different strategies. The one I prefer to do is what's the easiest and quickest things that can be done first. Mm-hmm. The reason I say that is because it creates momentum. Oftentimes, we're already feeling overwhelmed, trying to decipher what needs to get done, how am I going to do it. If you can identify the things that take the least amount of time and that can be done the quickest, it gives me some momentum, like, okay, I got that checked off, I got that checked off. Now I can kind of deal with the medium size kind of things. Another strategy is to really identify what needs to be done first. I know a lot of things feel like everything has to be done now. You gave the example of kids and homework, and what was the other one?
Like I need to prep something for my house for maintenance, and I have a work deadline.
So kind of looking at what can be done in the best order. So for example, if my kids are younger, their homework, they need to go to bed, it might be better to do that first, because then it gives me time to move, because I'm going to stay up a little bit later probably, have the kids in bed, finish their homework first, then I can move on to the other things that I need to do to get those things done. So part of it is pausing to evaluate what it is that I have to get done, and how am I going to proceed. And you can use the strategies of easiest first, or what actually time-wise needs to get done, and what's the best order from that perspective.
Right. And I guess I really like that approach, trying to pick out and prioritize, because maybe all of the things are priority. Maybe all the things need to get done this evening. Sometimes, maybe there isn't an order. Maybe there isn't a kid's bedtime and it feels like they all have to get done now. One thing to emphasize is this idea that it feels like they all need to get done. Question to always ask yourself, is something happening right now in front of you that needs your immediate attention? Is the homework stabbing you right now? Probably not. Are you about to get fired? Is your boss on the other line saying, if you don't get this done in 5 minutes, you're... More often than not, it's something that I feel. I feel overwhelmed. I feel stressed. I feel like I need to get all of these things done.
And that's not to say they don't need to get done.
True.
They are priorities.
But reminding yourself every 5 seconds that they need to get done, and if it doesn't, and kind of maintaining that visual, that's just keeping my brain in a fog. So
that's not validation. That's rumination.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah. And picking one thing at a time. To your point earlier, there might not be a best thing to pick.
Right.
Maybe at one point in time, we just need to pick. We need to recognize these things need to get done, yes, and I'm going to choose to work on this. Maybe I'll set a timer for 1 hour. I'm going to allot time to get as much as I can done with this, and then maybe I move on to the next thing. When you were talking about permission, this is kind of where I think that plays a role again, is that I'm going to give myself permission to pause on these 2 things, and I'm going to focus on this, not because these aren't priority, but because I can't focus on all 3 at once. I know it sounds like we're really good at multitasking, but in reality, I'm really good at half-assing a lot of different things, and I don't get them done. And then I feel overwhelmed during the experience of trying to get them done. And again, that's not an experience that I personally want to have.
Right.
Right?
And that's something we all have to decide on, right? So part of this is looking at past and evaluating it and determining, is that what I want to keep doing?
Right.
And if it isn't, what are my options?
What do I want? Yeah.
What do I want? How can I get it? And so looking at the different options is another way to feel less overwhelmed.
And more in control.
I also want to go back to another thing about validation. We talked about relief.
Mm-hmm.
When we're overwhelmed, we're stressed, we're tight, right? Validation sometimes creates relief. We actually settle down a little bit. Physically, from our mind's perspective, in terms of how fast it might be racing, we slow everything down when we create that validation, which also helps us to move to that next step, whatever that next step is.
Right.
And I think that's another key benefit to learning this process and continuously including that whenever we're feeling stuck or overwhelmed, is to look at that validation.
Kind of like the self-compassion we were talking about last week.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Giving yourself grace, giving yourself compassion, because again, if we're not, then we're kicking ourselves along the way, thus experiencing things in maybe less helpful ways or less preferred ways.
Yeah.
Right? And I think one thing I would maybe want to touch on in a couple weeks or maybe next week is the idea around verbiage and the words that we use. You were kind of talking about have to earlier, or I need to get this done. And really evaluating how that changes or shifts the experience that we're having. I don't know about you, but when I use words like that, like I have to, it adds this unnecessary pressure. Even if it's something that I like. Like if you told me I have to go to the beach this weekend, which I love the beach, I would feel like anxious, like, oh, I have to go. Like, what if I can? Or what if, as opposed to I love the beach, I want to go to the beach, I'm looking forward to the beach. I think maybe that might be something worth touching on now that you kind of mentioned it earlier.
I definitely, and I would add to that, not only the thoughts or the words that we choose, but what we hear from others, because we then repeat it, right? So what you say to me has to get done, I repeat. Now I'm thinking I have to get it done because you told me I had to get it done.
Right.
And now, right?
Can I translate that differently? Like the perspective you were talking about earlier. Can I shift the perspective, recognize is that somebody else's perspective that I'm taking on, or is that my own that I'm interpreting? So I think that's...
There's a lot to talk about.
I was going to say,
we got a couple different places to go with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple things for the time being that maybe we can start working on this week is this idea of, one, bringing back the awareness, like we talked about probably in our very first podcast that we did, and incorporating validation, recognizing, do I believe, or asking yourself rather, do I believe what I'm telling myself? If the answer is no, I guarantee you're not validating. I guarantee you're just powering through or giving yourself a pep talk that maybe other people would also give you. So asking yourself, is what I'm saying to help myself in this moment believable? And when it is, that becomes more validating. A key is the first two sentences of validation is usually how I put it to myself, so I can remember that tends to be validation. And for validation to be helpful, we also need to pivot into a direction of what do I want, kind of like Lou was describing earlier. So awareness, validation, what do I want? And then maybe next week we can touch on the verbiage of ourselves, other people, how that influences our experience.
Sounds like a plan.
All right,
All
see
right,
you guys
guys.
next week.
We'll keep thriving. See you next week.